Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Pacific Salmon Commission's Seminar Series on Environmental Variation in Pacific Salmon Management, the view from both sides of the border. My name is John Holmes and I'm the Canadian co-chair of the Coho Technical Committee, and I'm pleased to introduce the fourth seminar in our series. And this particular seminar is titled Management Strategy Evaluation of Pacific Salmon. And it features Dr. Cunningham from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Gottfried Pestal from SOLV Consulting Limited. Our seminar today is on management strategy evaluation. It's a tool, it's a process that's increasingly being used to address a variety of different problems in management, including what we might call wicked problems or issues with many interdependent factors, making them seem impossible to solve in the conventional optimization sense. Applications of MSE are increasing because while the approach may not lead to a conventional solution, it does provide improved understanding of the trade-offs that are necessary to support decision-making and actually move forward. So our two presentations today will provide some pointed insights into the use of management strategy evaluation in different ways to address both scientific and management issues in a thoughtful and thought-provoking way. But before we go any further, let me introduce you to our speakers. So Cunningham is an assistant professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences and is based in the Juneau campus. His faculty position is funded as part of the NOAA Quantitative Ecology and Socioeconomic Training Program, or QUEST. Prior to switching to the science side of fisheries, Curry worked as a commercial fisherman in Bristol Bay to fund his undergraduate studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And he'll be speaking to us today from his field camp on Bristol Bay. Gottfried Pestal is founding partner of SOLV Consulting Limited, and he specializes in practical applications of decision support methods. He designs custom visualizations of complex information, builds the data management structures that supply the underlying information. Gottfried has contributed to decision analysis for Fraser sockeye, Fraser Chinook, Skeena sockeye, Nass sockeye, Ethnarco sockeye, Taku coho, Taku sockeye, Stikine Chinook, Stikine sockeye, and Yukon Chinook. Pretty much any major salmon stock in Canada. He lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. The plan for today is to hear about environmental variation and implementation uncertainty in salmon systems from Curry, followed by harvest strategy evaluations from Gottfried. So two somewhat different applications of the same kind of approach. After the presentations have concluded, there will be a short break followed by a moderated question and answer session. So please use the question and answer feature to pose your questions to the speakers at any time during the presentations. Those of you who don't have a question can actually upvote the questions posed in the question and answer feature, and the moderators will take the highest voted questions and pose them to our speakers. Thanks, and that's really it for now. And now on with the presentations. Over to you, Curry.
Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to this group today. As a bit of a preview, I'm going to start with sort of a broad introduction to management strategy evaluation, some definitions, some ideas of process and uncertainty that we often confront. And then I'll talk a bit about a specific example of a management strategy evaluation for the Bristol Bay sockeye salmon fishery that we completed some years ago now. So first, to think about what is MSE, what is management strategy evaluation, rather than try to describe it in my own words, I'm going to point out some key sections of some pivotal papers that I think do an excellent job of succinctly and coherently describing these ideas. So from Andre Punt and colleagues in their 2016 paper, Management Strategy Evaluation Best Practices, MSE involves simulation to compare the relative effectiveness for achieving different management objectives of different combinations of data collection schemes, methods of analysis, and subsequent processes leading to management actions. So the idea of using simulation analyses to pose questions, given what we know about salmon systems or fishery systems more generally, to ask what are the trade-offs and what are the potential, what is the relative efficacy of different management actions that we might choose to pursue. From another great paper, Boonfield et al., MSC uses simulation models within an adaptive framework that enables the comparison of alternative strategies in a virtual world under multiple, often conflicting objectives. And I like this definition because, again, it highlights this idea of the critical simulation component of the MSC process, but also this idea of multiple objectives. When we think about objectives for a fishery, we can simply think about maximizing catch over short or long-term timescales. But in reality, when we start to speak with either fishery managers or stakeholder participants in the MSC process, we often find that the objectives we have for our fisheries and our fishery resources are more varied and more nuanced than we might expect from the beginning. So we might think of things, alternative objectives in addition to maximizing catch, minimizing long-term variation in catch, minimizing the likelihood of fishery collapse, for example. And of course, this all points back to what we think of as the holistic MSC process, including both the simulation exercise and an iterative process with fishery managers, fishery stakeholders to identify what the objectives are that we can evaluate over the long term. So finally, the question of why do we engage in this process? Why conduct an MSC? Well, the idea is that we want to identify fishery rebuilding strategies, perhaps, or ongoing harvest strategies that are robust to uncertainty and natural variation, and that balance biological and socioeconomic objectives. So the MSC process is a way that we can begin, based on what we know of systems, of biological systems or fishery systems, to understand how we might best pursue management actions in the future, given the uncertainties and natural variation that are inherent. And this is a critical piece of the puzzle. We want to, as best we can, represent the key uncertainties in our natural system and our management systems, such that when we go to evaluate trade-offs amongst alternative management strategies, we can have the best idea possible, or the most robust understanding of what that trade-off landscape looks like. So I'll highlight sort of 6 main types of uncertainty that we often confront within an MSC process, or more specifically, the simulation component of an MSC process. The first is estimation uncertainty, or uncertainty in the actual values for key demographic parameters that we're representing. This is in many ways the easiest piece of the uncertainty puzzle. Through most of our sort of modern standard Bayesian analyses, we get posterior distributions for model parameters, maybe our stock recruitment parameters, maybe maturity schedules and things of that nature. And we can directly incorporate that uncertainty in the estimated values for key demographic or fishery parameters in our forward simulations by doing draws from our joint posterior distribution, for example. So this is the first and often the easiest type of uncertainty to incorporate. The second is model or structural uncertainty. And this is uncertainty in the way we represent the underlying state dynamics of our biological fishery system. Things like, what is the shape in the context of salmon here of our stock recruitment relationship? Is it Ricker type? Is it Beverton Holt type? This can have major implications on our expected productivity for a salmon population we may want to simulate across multiple brood years. What is the assumed shape of the selectivity curve that we want to incorporate in our forward simulations? These sort of pieces of model or structural uncertainty are key to consider from the outset of an MSC process. The third is process uncertainty, or perhaps more directly, process variation. Things like the stochastic dynamics in our recruitment over time that may be correlated or uncorrelated. This is sort of a standard type of uncertainty we incorporate in most of our simulation analyses. The next is, of course, sampling uncertainty, uncertainty in the way we observe our system, whether we're talking about uncertainty in our escapement enumeration projects, the way we record or tabulate catch from a fishery, or uncertainty in the age or potentially length composition samples we might be collecting for a population. One of the key sources of uncertainty we want to propagate that leads to management imprecision is, of course, observation error sampling uncertainty. As part of our fishery management system. The fifth is assessment uncertainty. The models we use, conditional on our observations and the inherent sampling uncertainty or observation error, are assessment models that we use to drive harvest recommendations or divine harvest recommendations. We want to reflect as accurately as possible the uncertainty in perhaps our stock assessment process here. This is for blackcod or sablefish in Alaskan waters, but for any species we might be concerned about. We want to replicate any potential bias, any sort of autocorrelated error structure in terms of our assessment process as best we can, so we can come up with the most robust representation of our likely outcomes from alternative management actions. The last is, of course, implementation uncertainty that arises from the fact that the job of a fishery manager is difficult. In any given year, despite what your harvest target may be or your escapement target in the context of sockeye salmon that I'll be talking about in a few minutes here, that job is challenging. Fishery managers often have to make management decisions over very short timeframes in the context of salmon fisheries based on imperfect or delayed information. So this sort of implementation uncertainty can be quite large and important to consider in the context of our MSE process. So with an understanding of sort of the key types of uncertainty we often try to incorporate within the MSE process, we can talk about sort of the generalized steps. And of course, this is going to vary depending on the MSE and depending on who is involved in the MSE process more generally, but there are some common steps. And the first is usually to identify management objectives and performance metrics. What do we want to get out of our fishery? What are our objectives for sustainability of our fish stock over the long term? And how are we going to evaluate that? Do we want to assign some sort of probability of occurrence over some time frame threshold in order to make that more easy to calculate in the context of our simulation outputs? The next is to determine from that broad list we just discussed, what are the uncertainties we want to confront and which are most important to include in our forward simulation process as part of our management strategy evaluation. The third is to develop our harvest strategies. What's the range of harvest strategies or management methods or potentially data collection processes we want to explore? What do these look like? And which of these fit within our current legal structure is often a key question. On one hand, we may want to think outside the box fairly broadly, but we want to recognize we're also often constrained by particular aspects of our system or our legal structure. The next is to build an operating model that's conditioned on our observed data. Sorry, the joys of a field camp. We had a dog run into the building. We build our operating model or simulation model conditional on our observed data, what we know about the system. The next is to simulate our outcomes. And finally, to compare the performance of our alternative management strategies across these performance metrics that we've described or identified ahead of time. And so one of the key things I want to point out is that the MSE process involves these two critical pieces. One is development of the simulation, often closed loop simulation framework. The second is involvement and engagement with our stakeholder community throughout the process. And in particular, at several critical points. The sort of minimum steps in which we often would have stakeholder involvement are first in identifying our objectives and performance metrics, developing our harvest strategies, and then at the end, comparing performance of our alternative strategies. So we can think within this broader MSC process, what does our MSC simulation framework look like? We've talked a bit about the uncertainty, but what does it look like in practice? We have these key pieces. We have an operating model that generates our true, or at least true to the best of our knowledge, population dynamics and associated process variation. We have our sampling model, which generates from our population abundance indices, estimates of catch, estimates of age or length composition, whatever it might be, tagging data, survey information with observation error at a representative level. We then feed these observations into our assessment model or assessment models, whatever they look like, that estimate stock status or trends across time. And this, of course, gets fed into our management model, which takes the information we have on stock status or trends and converts this into a management action conditional on whatever our management procedure is that we're trying to explore. And of course, this then gets fed back into our biological operating model, and this loop continues forward across years in our closed loop simulation, and ideally across multiple replicate simulations that account for process variation and observation error and all these key pieces. So this gives us a general idea of both our MSC process as well as what our MSC simulation framework often looks like. But it's important from the outset, I think in my experience, both in salmon and in similar MSC analyses for groundfish, to acknowledge that there are some challenges associated with management strategy evaluation implementation. The first is one, there are some fairly high costs. A full MSC, including simulation analyses and stakeholder engagement, requires development time, computational resources, and a lot of people committing to get together on an iterative basis to dive deeply into these issues of both model development, identifying objectives and performance metrics. It requires obtaining stakeholder buy-in. Often you have to convince people how they're sacrificing their time and expertise in the short term will result in long-term benefit. What benefits are likely to accrue if you are willing to provide your time over a series of 5 meetings, say over 1 to 2 years. But this sort of stakeholder buy-in is incredibly important and necessary for maximizing the potential for individuals or groups to become a part of the process, which maximizes the potential for reducing conflict in the future based on the outcomes. One of the other challenges is that identifying objectives can be difficult. And in particular, translating objectives that stakeholders might have into something that is quantitative in a way that we can identify whether or not we're meeting those objectives based on the outcomes of simulation. So in my experience, it often comes down to listening to what people want out of their fishery or their concerns and converting that into some probability of occurrence over some time frame. Implementing an MSC requires a lot of knowledge about the system itself. And again, the key sources of uncertainty that are likely to be most important. And there's an incredible challenge within an MSC process in moving beyond what we have traditionally done in either a single stock or a single species framework. And it's important to recognize that from the outset. So with that foundation and background on MSC generally, I want to talk a bit about a specific example from Bristol Bay, Alaska, that started really in, this would have been in the mid-2010s, this process came about, and I think encapsulates these ideas of uncertainty and how we went about the process moving forward. So for this crowd, I probably don't need the introductory slide, but for those who don't know, Bristol Bay is nestled here in Southwest Alaska. That's where I'm sitting today. Hopefully my internet connection holds up. But in general, The commercial fishery in Bristol Bay is the largest in the state. One of the unique aspects about Bristol Bay is, of course, the tremendous variability we've seen in return abundance of sockeye salmon across time. Everything from 1973 here, a record low run of salmon to Bristol Bay at about 3.5 million, all the way up to 2021, record high at about 71 million fish returning to Bristol Bay. And of course, in addition to the high variability in total Bristol Bay run size among years, this is in millions of sockeye salmon, is of course the variation in the districts here, commercial fishing districts to which those fish, and by extension, the river systems to which those fish are returning. So in addition to highly variable run size from year to year, we often have high variability in what proportion end up going to what major river system or which fishing district is contributing most to catch year over year. So all of this leads to challenges in terms of in-season management of this fishery. So management of the Bristol Bay commercial fishery is really built upon regulation of effort in our 5 terminal fishing districts outlined here in red. Throughout the season, effort in these fishing districts is managed on a daily basis. An in-season manager decides tomorrow we're going to allow 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours of fishing activity for the drift fleet or the set net fleet. So effort is being actively managed in these 5 terminal fishing districts to achieve fixed escapement goals in these 9 major river systems around Bristol Bay. And so this comes down to one of the key challenges. Each of these fishery managers has to operate on imperfect information that is delayed to try to meet a management target. So as we'll see moving forward, encapsulating the challenges inherent in that process is an important piece of the simulation process or the MSC process we went through in this context. Now, the story of our Bristol Bay MSC process really begins with the Ricker stock recruitment relationship, as most things do. Back around 2012, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game had reevaluated escapement goals for the major river systems in Bristol Bay and found that the theoretically optimal spawning abundance, SMSY, that would produce maximum sustainable yield over the long term was significantly higher than the midpoint of the current escapement goals in this system. So in response to that, some proposed increases in the escapement targets for the Bristol Bay river systems were proposed at that time. However, there was some disagreement, and some believe that the escapement goal recommendations that were put forward at that time were somewhat inconsistent with the underlying biology of the system, especially when we consider sort of regime shift dynamics and productivity over time, and that there may be substantial costs in terms of foregone harvest in the event these escapement goals that were proposed at the time had gone forward. So in the several years that followed that 2012 proposal, the idea of a formal MSC process was put forward. And in about 2014 or late 2013, a group of various academic partners, agency partners, and industry participants were brought together to pursue an MSC process for the Bristol Bay sockeye salmon fishery. So the goal really was to compare these alternative escapement strategies. There were the current or status quo escapement goals as they were in place at the time. There were some proposed sustainable escapement goals that were a slight increase. There were the biological escapement goals, sort of the estimated SMSY, that were quite a bit higher than what was in place at the time. And a fourth harvest strategy where we had what we called a total run-based escapement goal policy. Basically, at the beginning of the season, based on the preseason forecast and the empirical estimates of uncertainty in the preseason forecast, if the run was projected to be, to each river system was projected to be above or below a threshold, there was either a lower or higher escapement target that was in place. And one of the goals from the outset was that we wanted to incorporate some of these sort of foundational sources of uncertainty, estimation uncertainty in our stock recruitment parameters, stochastic recruitment, of course, shifting production regimes. One thing we know about Bristol Bay sockeye salmon is that periodically there are these shifts in maximum productivity for these salmon systems. We wanted to account for that, as well as what can be substantial implementation uncertainty based on the in-season management process. And so we built this with sort of two components in place. One was a biological operating model, which simulated future production dynamics over time, and I'll talk about that, as well as a management submodel that tried to reflect the daily effort allocation decisions between these different terminal fishing districts, trying to reflect the challenges faced by an in-season manager for this fishery. I won't make you squint at this table too much, other than to say, for example, looking at the Ugashic River system down here, at the time we had the current sustainable escapement goals. These are in thousands of fish, so 850,000. The proposed sustainable escapement goal at 1 million. The biological escapement goal, SMSY, would have put it way up at 2.6 million. And then we had this total run-based escapement policy, where if the run was projected at the beginning of the season, total run to the Ugashic River system to be above 2.5 million, the escapement target would be 1.6. If it was projected to be below 2.5 million, the escapement target would be 850,000. And then at the midpoint of the season, the projected run size would be reevaluated, again with uncertainty inherent as we have in all of our forecasts, and that target would be adjusted as needed. So kind of a two-tiered escapement goal policy based on our best available information on run size at the beginning and midpoint of the season. So these were the four alternative management procedures or harvest strategies that we wanted to explore within this MSE context. One of the principal goals of this analysis was to account for the fact that many of the stocks in Bristol Bay have shown this periodic shift between recruitment regimes over time, high and low productivity states. And traditional methods for describing kind of recruitment patterns in Bristol Bay had either assumed that there was one underlying stock recruitment relationship, or assumed a fixed break point at some point in the time series, usually associated with the PDO shift in the late 1970s, early 1980s. However, we chose to use a somewhat different approach, whereby we assume that productivity for these sockeye salmon stocks had varied over time between high and low productivity states. And we allowed the data themselves to define both the magnitude of the differences in maximum productivity rate, potentially capacity between our high and low productivity regimes, as well as the frequency with which for a given stock, we expected it to transition between high and low productivity regimes moving forward into the future. And so we represented this sort of transition between high and low productivity regimes as a sort of first order Markov process, where you have separate Ricker alpha parameters, density independent productivity rates, as well as potentially different capacities. These are the posterior distributions for each, and this is an example for the Igigik River system. And you estimate both that absolute difference in maximum productivity, as well as the elements of a transition probability matrix, which describe, given your regime state in the current brood year, how likely are you to stay in the same regime state or transition to a more productive regime state, and so on and so forth. The end result was that we estimated here, this is alpha T, so our maximum productivity rate across time for several of the major river systems in Bristol Bay. We estimated both the history of regime occupancy as well as the probability of transitioning amongst regimes in the future, which is really what we wanted for our forward simulation as part of the MSE process. And so we can see that it differs by river system. Here in Igigik, we had pretty consistent low productivity regime dynamics up until the late 1970s, and we had this sort of consistent transition, this is across brood years, to a higher productivity state, which is informative, versus someplace like the Naknek River system, where there really wasn't a ton of evidence for shifting amongst alternative productivity regimes, and places like the Ugashic and Agushik rivers, where maybe those transitions between productivity states were occurred on a more frequent basis, for example. But at the end of the day, the goal was we can use this information on both the absolute difference in productivity between our regimes, as well as the probability of transitioning amongst regimes to propagate that sort of uncertainty forward as part of our simulation process. So our underlying biological operating model operated as sort of as you would expect. We generate future regime states across, in this case, 100-year time horizon based on our probability of transitioning amongst these different regime states that we've estimated from our data historically. We then simulate future recruitment based on our regime state specific rigor parameters that are drawn from the sort of joint posterior in each realization. So accounting for that estimation uncertainty in those rigor parameters, as well as the posterior correlation. And then we add some log normal recruitment deviation. So adding in our process variation. So accounting for those kind of three pieces of the uncertainty puzzle that we talked about before. The other key goal of this analysis was to sort of realistically, or as realistically as possible, account for implementation uncertainty or uncertainty in achieving the management or escapement target, given the constraints that are faced by a manager in real time. And there are some very real challenges. It's not an easy job. One of those is the mixed stock harvest conundrum that we're all very familiar with. So this is the Naknek-Kvichak district. This is the Kvichak, Naknek, and Alagnak river systems, and Kvichak, Alagnak, and Naknek river systems. And these are all harvested in a common fishing district. And so we needed to account for the fact that when escapement is behind its target for a given point in the season for one of these tributary streams, a manager realistically is going to have to reduce harvest pressure on all of the stock components, given that it's difficult to use spatial management measures to target one of these three migrating components. The other is, of course, what we know to occur in Bristol Bay, which is interception of fish bound for one river system in non-natal or non-home fishing districts during the return migration. This is an additional complexity that comes in. And the third one is really the fact that, unlike what we would have in an ideal world, every year is a little different in terms of the arrival distribution of sockeye to Bristol Bay. From one year to the next, the run is either early or late, or in this case, somewhat bimodal. From year to year, there's always some variation in the arrival timing and the arrival distribution of sockeye that presents challenges for in-season management. And so we wanted to account for that source of variation or that source of imprecision in implementation uncertainty as well, which in practice was fairly easy to do. What we did is basically just for every year historically, looked at the proportion of our reconstructed daily arrivals to each river system by day for each year, converted that to proportions. So in our forward simulation, we could just resample 1 year, 1 year's arrival distribution from all the possible arrival distributions historically for that river system, and use that to add that source of variation in our forward simulation. The final piece was, of course, to reflect, as I've said before, that the challenge in being an in-season manager. So, of course, there's these mixed stock management constraints. There is a delay in information. So on each day of the season, a manager sits down, looks at what escapement they have to the river system that they're managing relative to some escapement target for a given point in the season based on the average arrival distribution and the escapement goal. You can come up with your daily escapement target. And depending on whether or not you're ahead of that or behind that, a manager will adjust effort accordingly. I'm speaking very generally here. And so we wanted to simulate this adaptive management process and the difficulty inherent in achieving escapement goals based on sort of opening and closing fishing districts on a daily basis. And the fact that in most cases in Bristol Bay, fish are migrating through the fishing district where a manager has realistic control of effort between 2 and 7 days before they actually pass the counting dower and are caught as escapement. So we have this critical delay in information that ends up playing a vital role. So we created a sort of a series of decision rules that replicated the in-season decision process of a manager. And basically all it said was on a daily basis, if you're ahead of your escapement target, you open the fishery for the next day. If you're behind your escapement target, you don't open your fishery for the next day, and so on and so forth. So a very simple set of decision rules that we could use to replicate the in-season behavior of a fishery manager. And of course, part of this process and part of any sort of simulation process is what we think of kind of conditioning on our data. Do we do a good job of reflecting past dynamics? And so with this simple management model that replicated the in-season decision fishing district opening and closing behavior of a manager, our question was, if we fed in data historically, how well could we reflect the escapement outcome that actually observed? When we fed in daily escapements and daily harvest, how well did our simulated manager perform relative to the actual in situ manager in each year? So what I have plotted here for each major river system on the x-axis, each point is an individual year. This is the observed escapement in millions. On the y-axis is the simulated escapement from our simulated management, our simulated manager with our set of decision rules. And so ideally, of course, each of these years would fall on the 1-to-1 line. When our simulated manager was confronted with the same information, generally speaking, that our in-season manager or the actual in-season manager had in each year, we do a decent job of achieving the same outcome. That is to say that when presented with the same information, our simulated manager performed or achieved escapements of a similar magnitude compared to our what was actually observed in each year. So with each of these pieces in place, we had what we can think of as our complete MSE simulation framework. We simulated our future regime occupancy over time, variation between high and low productivity states for each river system, conditional on how frequently they've been observed to transition in the past, simulate our future recruitment with process variation, conditional on the regime state, use the average maturation schedule to allocate these individuals from a brood year forward in time to return years. Then based on the total returns in a given year, the intro run size, we can allocate that across days within season by resampling one arrival distribution from the history of arrival distributions for that particular river system, feed this into our simulated management model, and then repeat this process forward over time. And so the results were in some ways somewhat surprising. So I'm going to show you a series of figures here. Here is the distribution of sockeye salmon escapement across this 100-year time horizon of forward simulation and across our replicate iterations. In black is the current, or at the time, were the current sustainable escapement goals, the proposed sustainable escapement goals, the biological escapement goals, so SMSY, and the distribution of observed escapement or simulated escapement under our total run-based escapement goal policy. So on the x-axis here is escapement in millions for each of our major river systems. And what we see, looking at the Nushagak River system here, for example, is that there's a tremendous amount of variation in our expected escapement in the future and across our replicate simulations. The modes of these different distributions might look a little different, and as you would expect, as you go across these different harvest strategies, what you see is slightly increased escapement all the way up to our biological escapement goal, but a lot of variability, again, arising from implementation uncertainty and the challenges associated with the in-season management process. We see down here for some of these other systems, of course, for our total run-based escapement goal policy, where we have these two targets, depending on our estimate of run strength in a given year, you're either targeting the lower or upper escapement goal. We see this bimodality in our simulated future escapement, as we would expect. And then for some of these river systems, the Igigik and the Ugashik river systems that are harvested in terminal fisheries that don't encompass the mouth of multiple river systems and our single stock fisheries, we see greater separation between our estimated escapements or simulated escapements forward in time, again, because they're to some extent released from these mixed stock management constraints. What I have plotted here, other outcomes from our MSC simulation analysis. This is the percent difference in harvest relative to what was expected under the sort of the current escapement goal strategy at the time. So negative, lower expected catch or lower expected harvest in the future, positive values, higher expected harvest in the future. And the distribution described by these box plots is the variation across future years and of course across replicate simulations, accounting for all that process variation and observation error. And so we saw a couple of things. First, we found that for all stocks, the total run-based escapement goal policy, so here in black, our black box plots, were expected to produce more yield in the future relative to the current management strategy, or as much yield in the future relative to our current management strategy, sort of across river systems. And in no case, based on our simulations, did the biological escapement goals or targeting SMSY, in no case was that expected to lead to the highest potential harvest in the future moving forward, given our regime shift dynamics that we encapsulated in this simulation process. Finally, we sort of looked at our results on an aggregate basis for Bristol Bay as a whole, and this is one way that we could look at things. So this is again under our 4 alternative management strategies. The lower escapement goals that were in place at the time, kind of the intermediate proposed sustainable escapement goals, the biological escapement goals targeting SMSY, and our total run-based escapement goal policy. So this is just summing across river systems. Again, here is the median 50 and 95% confidence interval for these projections. And what we see, of course, is that as you move from the current sustainable escapement goals up through the biological escapement goals, your expected escapement increases. Our total run-based escapement goal policy being somewhere in the middle. We expect total returns to increase. So that is future return abundance of sockeye salmon on aggregate to Bristol Bay scales up as your expected escapement scales up under these alternative harvest strategies. But the same is not true of harvest. What we saw is that for Bristol Bay as a whole on aggregate, the median expected harvest in the future was highest either under the proposed sustainable escapement goals or the total run-based sort of 2-tiered escapement goal policy. And then finally, and this came out of our conversation with fishery stakeholders, everyone was very concerned about what they thought of as very low harvest or what might be considered fishery disaster years in which catch would have been, the likelihood of catch being below 5 million, below 10 million, or below 15 million, and the proportion of years that was expected to occur in the future. And in addition to the biological escapement goal targeting SMSY not having the highest expected harvest moving in the future, there was also an increased likelihood of catch below these critical thresholds that obviously fishery stakeholders wanted to avoid at all costs. So another reason that this was not highlighted as the optimal policy moving forward. So some general conclusions, and apologies to Gottfried for getting a bit long-winded here, but with respect to this Bristol Bay MSC process, we found that targeting the theoretical optimum, the biological escapement goal, or SMSY, was unlikely to result in maximum harvest opportunity, given the shifting production regimes we've seen, given the implementation uncertainty associated with our mixed stock fishery management challenges and delayed information that we have in Bristol Bay. And that the biological escapement goals that had been proposed would lead to increased catch variation in the future, or were likely to in a greater number of years with no fishing, although it wasn't extremely large, either no fishing or low levels of harvest opportunity. And that our sort of 2-tiered or total run-based escapement goal policies led to sustained harvest and really low risk or low proportion of years with very low harvest. And at the end of the day, these were sort of supported by stakeholders and fishery managers to the extent that they were implemented in the following cycle, or a version of them. And one of the key takeaways for me, being kind of the analyst in this MSE process, was that stakeholder involvement was really critical to the success we had. It increased understanding and transparency. By having these repeated meetings and making it an iterative process, everyone is brought along, even if they didn't have, a quantitative background. By sort of building on our conversations in prior meetings, we were able to build a common understanding of what we were trying to do in the process we were going through. Everyone provided useful feedback in terms of their objectives for the fishery, what they wanted to avoid, what was most important in terms of valuing outcomes. From the processing side, there was a lot of input on sort of revenue, product form, and processing decisions, processing capacity being something critical to consider. And at the end of the day, I think going through this MSE process led to, I think, greater acceptance and a lack of conflict as new escapement goals were proposed following this activity. So with that, I apologize for going a bit over time, and thank everyone. I think we'll do questions at the end if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And thanks very much for your presentation, Curry. You're correct. We will take questions at the end of both presentations. So next presentation is by Gottfried Pestal. Gottfried, over to you.
Okay, let me start this up. Hello, everybody. I think it'll be a bit of a change of pace. The second presentation, but Curry has touched on a lot of the issues that obviously come up in my talk as well. So I think there's a good balance between the two, and I think it'll work to have questions at the end. So for my part of today's presentations, I'll talk about equilibrium, change or instability, and what the implications might be for salmon harvest strategy. And I'll start off with some context about myself and what the point is of my talk here. Then I do get a bit philosophical, thinking about things we need to keep in mind and ideas for how to approach those. I'll try to distill some advice out of that. As sneak preview, there'll be some good news and some bad news. And then I do have some examples. I'll have a general example in terms of comparing a fixed escapement strategy with a stepped exploitation rate strategy. And then I'll have, as a specific example at the end, I'll do a very brief recap of the evolution of Fraser sockeye harvest strategy. So as John said at the beginning, I've worked on salmon escapement goals and harvest rules for quite a few of the river systems in the Pacific Northwest. My role has mostly been focused on data analysis and communication. And so that's how I'm approaching this talk as well, from the back end, so to speak. Along the way, I've had a lot of long-running debates with a lot of folks that are here, including Curry. We just worked on Yukon Chinook escapement goal review together. But in the last few years, I've had, I'd say, the most intensive discussions with the group of folks listed here. So that's Anne-Marie, Brendan, Bronwyn, Kerry, Charmaine, Pete, and Sue. And so what I'm trying to do today is I've been trying to connect the ideas that are buzzing around collectively in all these conversations. And then the opportunity for this talk came along. And back then, when I first saw it, the session topic was still called New Management Strategies for Uncertain Times. And so what you get today from me is some thinking out loud about this very ambitious question, what are strategies for uncertain times? And before I get into the details, I do offer these thoughts in the spirit of Cunningham's law, which says that the best way to get the right answer on the internet is not to ask the question, it is to post the wrong answer. So I'll throw out some suggestions, I'll see what you think, and I'm looking forward to the question and answers session at the end, and any follow-up chats that you might want to have. So one way for structuring the conversation around these topics is to group it into different types of thinking. And so there's one approach is to think about stable equilibrium, where you basic concept is that you look for the underlying mechanisms, you try to understand the implications of the mechanisms, like what state does a system settle into if there's no disruption from the outside, like trying to understand the basic dynamics of a predator-prey relationship, for example. Then if you think about uncertainty, it's really how to account for uncertainty in the data, in the model fits, in the in-season information, in implementation, the kind of thing that Curry was just talking about. Thinking about variability is a bit different because here you start thinking about how you respond to annual differences, still assuming that the underlying mechanisms are stable or predictable. Another way of thinking about the challenges is to think about change, like how do we deal with long-term persistent changes? And I think finally, there's thinking about instability, which is how do you deal with extremes and breakdowns in basic mechanisms? And so in terms of salmon management, stable equilibrium, you think about spawner recruit models, the biological benchmarks like SMSY that you calculate from those. And as Curry was just showing, to incorporate uncertainty there, you work on Bayesian versions of the estimates of the parameters and the benchmarks. If you're thinking about variability, you plan for different types of pre-season and in-season scenarios, again, as Curry just illustrated with the simulated fisheries manager. Then you can expand this a little bit and start thinking about change. Like how do you detect and respond to gradual changes, such as declining fecundity over time? And in terms of instability, it's really more about rapidly or setting up a process that rapidly identifies any major problems and having some pre-planned guidelines in place to respond to those issues as they come up. So in terms of salmon-related work that's being done, I would summarize it as these first three, equilibrium, uncertainty, and variability, is really what most of us have worked on over the last 20 years. We're still working on them. There has been a lot of evolution in terms of how to do this, best practices. And the tools keep improving. Like there's new software for doing Bayesian analyses, these kinds of things. In terms of thinking about change, I want to highlight one research initiative, which is being led by Kerry Holt and Brendan Connors. And so connect with them and find out more. In terms of instability, there is a discussion paper on climate change implications for salmon that's being developed by Bronwyn McDonald and Sue Grant. And again, I encourage you to follow up with them to get the details and find out more. So one important clarification to make is that if you break it down this way into these 5 types of thinking, it's not like one of them is better or more appropriate or more sophisticated than the others. In my mind, they complement each other, and we need to think about all of these angles when we approach salmon management. The other thing I want to clarify, that really this distinction between the 3 on the bottom here, it's fuzzy and it's a bit arbitrary. So for now, I'm trying to tease it apart based on the speed, magnitude, and direction of change. And I'll illustrate that a bit better when I get to the details. So with these types of thinking, what are the tools that we have to apply those? I think our typical fisheries toolkit is built around simulation modeling. And as Curry just described, management strategy evaluation, you take the simulation model and you combine it with a process that really looks at the inputs and the options and how to convert the outputs from the model into actual decisions, actual management. You've all heard of adaptive management, where I think the real focus was on setting up a system that learns more about the stocks and about the management so that it can improve over time. There's decision analyses where you really focus on a few specific options and compare the performance of those options. So there's kind of overlap between those, but that's I would say the typical toolkit for fisheries. We can also borrow tools from other fields. One I want to highlight is choice modeling, where you basically create surveys that offer a lot of specific scenarios that respondents have to make a choice. Then you have a group like this, everybody fills out the survey, and then you extract the preferences. You build a model of how the choices are being made. Another domain we can look at or borrow from is first aid, where really the focus is on developing pre-planned guidelines for common types of scenarios. Similar to what Curry said about the simulated fisheries manager and how they compare in-season information to the target. Another domain we can look at is emergency preparedness. And I think of that really as preparing for larger scale stuff that happens sooner or later. So that might be like a province or a state preparing for flooding. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you know eventually there will be flooding. So you need to have resources in place to respond to that. And then there's another kind of gradation from that, which is contingency planning, where agencies or organizations prepare for unlikely but catastrophic eventualities. So it's a different scale of planning and a different scale of events that you're trying to get ready for. So each of these domains has a large body of literature, a lot of details, but in practice, I'd say there's a lot of overlap in terms of the basic concepts. And really, if you boil it down to the essence, there's two basic ideas that they all have in common. So you really focus on considering alternative scenarios. You ask a lot of what if questions, and you have to consider alternative objectives. And it might be what's the best strategy or the safest strategy or the most robust strategy for managing a particular stock. But in this simple word, best or safest, there's a lot of underlying details and trade-offs and considerations that are baked into it. And as Curry pointed out, these are where a process gets tricky in order to try and define them. So some specifics about these two basic ideas. In terms of alternative scenarios, like you've heard, these are standard practice. Consider alternative scenarios or assumptions. But I do think that in a circumstances of climate instability, it means that we need to consider a wider range of scenarios, so that what's defined as plausible means something different now than it might have 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so that might affect the kinds of questions that we ask. So if you think about uncertainty and variability, you might ask questions like, what if the Ricker model is wrong for this stock that we're looking at? Or what if this year's run comes in at the very low end of the forecast? If you're thinking about change, it's questions more like, what if fecundity persistently decreases? Or what if recent low productivity for a stock persists into the future? Or what if recent high migration mortality persists into the future? So it's a different kind of question. In terms of thinking about instability, on the biological side, you might ask questions like, what if you're dealing with the earliest marine migration ever, or the latest marine migration ever, or some extreme shift in marine migration routes, or you're dealing with the lowest overall productivity or the largest total return, the smallest total return you've ever seen. There are environmental questions that you can ask around instability, like what if there's major landslides that have a significant impact on migration success, have a significant impact on the spawning grounds? What if there's large-scale fires in your watershed? What if there's a record warm ocean? So these are big questions, but I do want to point out that since I started working on Fraser Sock, we have seen all of these events, and some of them we've seen multiple times. So that's a reminder that as we use a tool like management strategy evaluation, we may want to explore a broader set of what if questions. So the second basic idea is, you think about alternative objectives. And again, here we can use this kind of different categories of thinking about the problem to identify different sets of questions. So if you think about equilibrium, you might ask, what is the optimal spawner abundance over the long run in stable conditions? If you're thinking more about uncertainty and variability, it's what is the optimal range of spawner abundances over the long run, given uncertain parameter estimates and year-to-year variation? Or, should spawning targets respond to annual variation given in-season uncertainty? If so, how should that be done? And the total run-based escapement goal that Curry just illustrated would be an example of that. If you're thinking about change, it's something like, which strategy is robust to gradually changing conditions, such as a decline in productivity? And if you're thinking about instability, it might be what kinds of contingency plans would produce the least bad outcome across a range of extreme scenarios. And so one way to think about this is to try and find strategies that avoid spectacular failures, even under more extreme types of scenarios. So in summary, I'd say that the good news is that we have the conceptual tools to think about these types of challenges and prepare for them. The bad news is that this is hard. Actually, what we do in fisheries is not rocket science. It is much, much harder than that. And here I'm quoting Mike Staley, which I think a lot of you know, and you might not know that his brother is a rocket scientist, and his brother actually teaches new rocket scientists. So we have it straight from the expert that what we do is much harder. And I will leave the philosophical part of the presentation with one more quote, which is that the problem with the future is that it keeps turning into the present. So what I take away from that is that we should try and prepare for it the best we can. And now, after all this detour, what does all of this mean for salmon harvest strategies? Some key points to consider. One is how we calculate reference points like SMSY versus how we use them. Management strategy evaluation really focuses on the second part. And the examples I'll show in a minute also talk more about the second component. I do also think that we have to, in terms of preparing for unstable times, I think we do need to adjust a little bit what we consider the plausible range of scenarios, keeping in mind that throwing out scenarios and trying to figure out how you might respond, it's not the same as predicting a particular scenario. So you plan for contingencies, but you hope for the best kind of thing. And it might also mean that you have to accept bounds on what is possible in the near or medium term in terms of long-term objectives that you might have, that you might eventually want to achieve versus what is possible in the near term. So what can we actually do right now? I think one of the tools we have is to use some simple interactive tool apps to think about these types of broad questions, use those discussions to scope out general options for contingency plans. And then within that, you can identify specific scenarios and specific candidate strategies, which you then bring into the detailed simulation testing within an MSC framework. And I think you can use these simple interactive tools also to communicate the rationale for a candidate strategy to a broader audience to elicit some feedback. Like, does this strategy basically make sense given these types of situations we might face in the future? So I will give a very quick illustration. The next few slides were taken from this interactive tool. I'll keep the link online as part of the slides. And if you go to the app, you'll see there's links to the source code and some worked examples from different fisheries. And there'll be some links to further reading. And we can have discussion threads there to figure out how to improve this tool. So as an illustration, we start with a strategy like a fixed spawning target at SMSY. Curry in his presentation had a dartboard that you're trying to hit the bullseye. That's the idea. So if you have perfect information and everything is at equilibrium for this imaginary stock, let's say your SMSY estimate is 50,000 fish, your sustainable exploitation rate is 50%. At equilibrium, you would get 100,000 run size every year. You would harvest half of it. You would have 50,000 spawners. The offspring would be 100,000 fish in the next generation. So if everything is stable, that's where you would exactly manage to. However, you start thinking about uncertainties. What if the run size is uncertain? Do you still manage to the same spawning target at the lower end or the upper end of the estimated run? Or do you adjust? One other way of looking at it is converting this fixed escapement goal into the corresponding exploitation rate. And so then you see that even though you have a very specific, simple rule, it says manage to this escapement goal, in terms of the exploitation rate that might be implied, now you have a range that covers from 40 to 60%. And you'd have to decide at the low end of the in-season estimate versus the high end, how do you structure the fisheries? Which of these do you manage to? Another question you might ask is, what if the run size is a lot larger than your SMSY range? If you manage to fix escapement policy, you end up with a much larger exploitation rate. So in this case, at the upper end of this uncertain run size estimate, you'd be in the 80% exploitation rate. You have to think about whether or not that makes sense for your stock. You have to think about, what if this is for a group of stocks with different productivity? Do you still apply the same strategy, or do you adjust to that? Another question might be, what if stock composition is very different this year? Do you follow the same strategy, or do you adapt it somehow? Another question might be, what if this is the in-season estimate, but you've seen the fish returning smaller and younger over time? Do you stay with that? Do you build in a regular update? How do you respond to that type of scenario? One approach might be to say, well, maybe a single fixed escapement goal doesn't meet all of the criteria we're looking for. So you might consider something like a stepped exploitation rate. That would deal with some of the concerns around the upper end, a very large run size. You can specify a cap on exploitation rate. And for a situation like this, across most of the uncertain run size estimates, you'd have a very clear prescription in terms, in this case, a 70% exploitation rate. What if the run size is much smaller? Again, you'd have a fairly clear-cut guidance in terms of what the target is. But what if there's more uncertainty in the run size estimate? Suddenly you have a situation where you have, after a lot of hard work, you have a harvest rule, and then you get to an in-season situation where the harvest rule says your target exploitation rate is anywhere between 0 and 50%, depending on which end of the spectrum the run size comes in at. So that was an illustration of just using a simple diagram really to think about these types of questions. In terms of a specific example, here's how Fraser-Sake harvest strategies have evolved, excuse me, so far. Some context first, there is 4 management units on Fraser-Sake. They were originally based on migration timing, but there have been some tweaks over time. In the 1980s, there was a rebuilding plan developed, which said you manage to a fixed spawning target, but the spawning target itself ramps up over time by being specified to have at least as much as the brood year. But then in the early 2000s, there started a review of the spawning targets in response to substantial observed changes in migration timing, in terms of in-river mortality, in terms of abundance that we were seeing, and in terms of productivity. And since 2007, Fraser-Sake now have been managed to abundance-based harvest rules where the key features have stayed the same over time, but the details have been tweaked every year based on preseason expectations. And so before I show you what those rules actually look like, in terms of linking it back to MSE, for Fraser-Sake, this has been over 15 years of intensive process with stakeholders and rights holders, and also intensive modeling. And at the same, so I want to emphasize the same thing that Curry said, that management strategy evaluation is really a journey. And if you start one, you might be in it for a very long haul. So illustrating what that looks like on the Fraser is a fixed escapement policy from the 1980s rebuilding plan, which has this shape, all of the issues that we just talked about, that I just showed. The first major change was to put in a cap when run sizes are large. So that's a cap on the rate, removal rate, for 2 purposes. The first one is to protect component stocks with lower productivity. And the second one is to probe larger spawner abundances for more productive stocks, given that capacity estimates are highly uncertain. And so there's an adaptive learning component built into that. And so these are examples of thinking about the uncertainty and variability in the system. The second big change was to specify a total allowable mortality rather than an exploitation rate, so that it takes into account in-river mortality. And so that's an example of thinking about the instability of the system, because the in-river mortality component is linked to things like the river flow, river temperature, events like the Big Bar landslide can be taken into account. And there's an explicit structure for responding to these kinds of situations when they arise. The final step, the final new piece in the harvest strategies was a minimum exploitation target. So regardless of abundance and regardless of in-river mortality, there is a bottom end, a minimum exploitation rate that's applied to allow for test fishing, for food, social, ceremonial fisheries, and for overlap between timing groups. So as a final point, over many years of simulation testing and discussion, what we found was that the specific values for these three components here on the right, the abundance where you start cutting back, the removal rate, where exactly that cap is it at 60 or 62 or 64%? Those made relatively little difference in the kind of uncertain forward simulations. If you have 10,000 trajectories into the future, whether or not this cap is a few percent up or down makes very little difference in the simulation output, but it can make a big difference in the implementation in any particular year. But what we found was that really, as long as you have these measures in, as long as there is a cap, and as long as you have an abundance where you start cutting back on removal rates, and as long as you have this minimum level that allows for these other components, as long as you have that in place, and the big one is the total allowable mortality. The specific numbers or specific values were less important than the fact that you had these components of the harvest strategy. And that was the examples for me. So I want to point you to the app that has allows you to try different run sizes, different breakpoints, different types of strategy. If you want to dig deeper, check out the GitHub repository that has some worked examples and some discussion threads, and I'll put more examples on there. And if you want to talk more, connect with me and we'll figure out a forum for that conversation. And before I wrap up, I want to especially thank Anne-Marie and Charmaine for improving and streamlining the material that I presented here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gottfried, and thank you, Curry, for two thought-provoking and presentations. And we currently have 15 minutes allotted for Q&A, but we've decided to extend that by about 15 minutes to get, we already have a number of questions in the Q&A box. But before we get to that, we're going to just take a short break.
Wanted to start with a comment from Urs Thomas. He says, thanks to both of you, excellent presentations with a high value for PSC members. So always good. And I really enjoyed the way you both talked about the same thing, but from very different angles. So that's very cool. Our first question is from Gary Morishima. He asks, the question is for Curry, for the MSE steps. Can you expand on the importance of characterizing uncertainties and risks for representation in simulation models? In addition, what are best practices regarding validation of project results?
Yeah,
I realize that's quite a bit.
No, fantastic question or series of questions there. So, I mean, in my presentation, I talked a bit about kind of the broad suite of sources of variation or uncertainty that we might consider. At the end of the day, a lot of it is going to come down to thinking about which of those are likely to be most important or most likely to drive outcomes in your process. You know, for some systems, implementation uncertainty, how close we are to hitting the bullseye of that target may be small. For other systems, it may be incredibly large, given just due to you know, inherent uncertainties and in-season information that's available to management, for example, or delays in when that information becomes available. So I think one of the initial steps is critically to think about which of these sources of variation or uncertainty are likely to have the biggest impact, and ensure you think critically about how to represent those. Let's see, the second part, best practices for Validation of projected results. That's another important piece. So as with any simulation framework, our first step is model validation, right? Can we accurately reflect past demographic conditions given the framework we're going to use to try to make some predictions about future dynamics under alternative management scenarios, for example? Number one is, can we reconstruct the past accurately? And if the answer is no, then full stop. You need to reevaluate how you're conditioning your operating model and your observed data.
Thank you, Curry. So the next question is for Gottfried. We'll switch it up here. So is there a reason why incorporation of precautionary management principles or control rules were not listed in the toolbox?
That's a good question. I think there's two parts to it. One is I didn't think of it, but now that I think of it a bit more, I would say that the precautionary principle is really, it comes under the heading of different types of objectives or different types of questions that you're asking. So it's not so much a tool as a principle for how you use any one of these tools. Like it defines the kinds of scenarios or the kinds of objectives that you try out, rather than, you can have precautionary elements, or you can think about precautionary principle in a formal decision analysis or in an MSE or in any of the other tools.
Great. And we have another question for Curry. This is from Dan Auerbach. He says, great presentation. In the slide you had that was showing the simulation results versus the observations, it looked like that at least one river was consistently conservative bias in almost all the points were above the 1-to-1 line, which suggests to him that there's a potential to gain system insights even before reaching the comparison of goals under future simulations. So he's asking, in your experience, have stakeholders recognized and valued this potential insight that you gain?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan, for the question. I think you're referring to kind of our comparison of escapement outcomes between kind of our simulated manager based on these decision rules. Are you ahead or behind your target escapement for a given date in the season versus what was actually observed in each of those years when provided ostensibly with the same information? And you're right. In an ideal world, our simulated manager would have had exactly the same outcome as what was observed, and all those points would have fallen on the 1-to-1 line, and they didn't. And there's a couple instances. So I think in terms of the Nushagak River, the sort of simulated escapements tend to be on average a bit higher than the observed escapements in those years, and that sort of inconsistency between our simulated approach and the observed outcomes are important to consider. So why is that occurring? Well, I like to say, quote unquote, simulated manager is based on a series of short-term decision rules. Are you ahead or behind? Subject to the delay in escapement information. In reality, system managers in Bristol Bay have additional information from aerial surveys of the river, kind of knowing how many fish are below the escapement enumeration site or the counting tower, and are likely to cross that threshold and be counted the next day. There's auxiliary information that we really couldn't represent within this framework that those managers likely have or do have access to in reality. There's test fishery information offshore, all of these bits and pieces that are a bit hard to represent within our kind of simplistic decision rules to reflect their behavior, likely play a critical role in that difference between kind of observed and predicted escapement. And in response to the second part of your question, I think even without all the simulation stuff down the line, I think there was a key takeaway from some that were involved in this process about the key challenges in being an in-season manager. Everyone loves to criticize, right? We all like to be backseat drivers when it comes down to fishery management, but realizing the challenge that these managers are facing based on delayed escapement information and making these real-time decisions about opening or closing fisheries, considering mixed stock management constraints, and considering potential for interception in other fishing districts is a really challenging puzzle to solve. And I think for some of the stakeholders that were involved with this, getting that perspective on the reality of the challenges faced by fishery managers and how imperfect that information sometimes is was really important, aside from any of the sort of actual simulation exercise.
Thank you so much. So we have a question that will be posed for both of you, and we'll start with Gottfried. So this is from Gary Morishima. So with environmental change, extremes, tipping points, and the accelerating pace of change will be expected. So will we be contending with conditions beyond our experience? And how should we deal with venturing into that unknown? And Gottfried, I'm starting with you because some of the questions you posed were, kind of our good framework for designing studies like this.
Yeah, I think the most important step is actually that this question is being asked. Like, I think that the first step is that we collectively try to grapple with those, and which we are. And I think then the next component is that, we won't be able to quantitatively model everything right away. So it's this notion of it's this idea of maybe you can just use some simple tools to do a lot of brainstorming, and that brainstorming in the sequence for management strategy evaluation that Curry outlined, there's a lot of planning and figuring out and brainstorming just what the scope of the model would be, what the key components are that you want to model. And so I think it's using the tools we already have, but just trying to ask these bigger questions. And at first, I think this will be just qualitatively talking through it with a group like this to get different perspectives. I don't think there's a way around the process side of just a whole lot of talking with a whole lot of people.
Curry, do you have something to add to Gary's question regarding dealing with environmental change and tipping points and increasing uncertainty? And
yeah, a little bit. Gottfried's response was fantastic. I think the one thing I would add is that in many of these analyses, in the analysis that I was talking about for Bristol Bay, we're kind of conditioning on past information, and those past conditions may or may not reflect what we're likely to see in the future under directional climate change. Certainly here in Alaska, when we started this MSC process, the idea that we would have seen 70 million sockeye salmon return to Bristol Bay was unheard of, and we've now seen that. So we're seeing different things. We won't always have the opportunity to predict what we're likely to see in the future with respect to either abundance, with respect to survival, with respect to migration, or maturation schedules. But these sort of analyses allow us to pose some what if questions. And as Gottfried said, starting out and thinking very broadly about what if the future state of nature is very different from what we see now. What does that mean for our management outcomes in the future is really important to cast that broad net in terms of potential future scenarios.
So Curry, we have a question for you for Brittany Genuine. She says, great presentation, Curry. I'm interested and have many questions, but we'll try and limit it to a few. How long did it take you to get the MSE up and running for Bristol Bay sockeye? And did you find there were particular data gaps that need to be filled before you can implement it? And are the papers you represented or referenced the best place to start for learning more about MSE, or are there other references or step-by-step guides elsewhere?
Sure, great questions. So I'll take it in pieces here. So how long did it take? I would say all told, process in Bristol.
Appear to be having some technical difficulties.
Hopefully he comes back on shortly.
In the meantime, I may just announce that our next seminar is going to be held July 20th, and it is going to feature Lori Whitecamp, as well as Steve Latham from the Pacific Salmon Commission Secretariat. And they will be presenting on the 2022 International Year of the Salmon results. So Lori on sort of the catches and Steve on the genetic composition of catch. Sorry, Curry, we lost you for a moment. So just an interlude. If you would like to to begin again?
Sure. Sorry about that. The joys of field camp internet connections. It's better than it used to be. So in answer to your question, I think the entire process from start to finish was about 2 years with several meetings with our stakeholder group. And I wanted to highlight that that process was funded in large part by the Bristol Bay Regional Seafood Development Association. And we had fantastic collaboration from Alaska Department of Fish and Game staff and researchers, as well as partners in the fishing industry. So it wouldn't have been possible without all those groups and funding support. Let's see, what was the other part of the question here? I apologize.
So data gaps.
Oh, yes.
Which particular data gaps that could be filled before being implemented?
Certainly. I think so. There were two parts, and I didn't talk about the subsequent sort of bioeconomic analyses that went along with this. I think there were some huge data gaps in terms of the processing side, product forms, and how processing decisions regarding lower value versus value added products would be made depending on how large the harvest was. And I think some of the critical data gaps are on that side. In terms of the biological information, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has and continues to do an excellent job of collecting those. So we had those key pieces in hand. One of the biggest challenges was just thinking about how we implement this in-season decision-making process in a hopefully representative way.
And finally, for the last thing is references, and perhaps you can send us a list and we can distribute it as well if there are particular papers that you think would be really informative, et cetera.
Sure, certainly. In addition to there was a special issue in the Canadian Journal looking at MSC more broadly from salmon across multiple species, and then a couple kind of foundational papers on the MSC process associated with that, but happy to provide a list.
Fantastic, thank you.
So Gottfried, I am going to ask you a question that's actually not from the Q&A box, but is related to your presentation. And if you could, so you had mentioned that addressing instability in harvest strategies is very challenging, but also you suggested that Sue Grant and Bronwyn McDonald were engaging in some of this work, environmental variation and climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that work or that proposed work and some of the questions that they're addressing?
I can very generally point you to, so they are compiling a discussion paper on observed issues related to climate change and options for strategies. So I think it's ideas around climate vulnerability assessments and so on. So I think this is not like years out. I think this is probably a few months, but by the end of the summer, by the time everybody's back from field season, there should be a discussion paper, but check with them on the details. And really just wanted to highlight that this is coming and to keep an eye out for it.
Great. And one final question for Curry. This is from Joy Thorkelson. She says that as she understood it, the model that was accepted was the one that resulted in high harvest, but not higher escapement model that did not lead to higher harvest. The acceptance of the model that maximized harvest over maximized escapement, was this due to the stakeholder goal of maximum escapements or over the maximum harvest? Or how was that choice made?
Yeah, thanks to Joy for this question. And so there was sort of the extreme scenario, which was targeting the spawning abundance expected to produce maximum sustainable yield over the long term. So those would have been much higher escapement targets. And at the end of the day, that wasn't preferred because when we went through the process of simulating future regime dynamics and all the parts and pieces, it didn't seem that increase in escapement would lead to a commensurate increase in harvest opportunity in the future. And in fact, you would have a higher proportion of years where there was little to no harvest opportunity under that strategy. So the end result was there was a general preference for this sort of two-tiered escapement goal policy where you adjust your target conditional on your expectation for what run size is in the given year. In higher years, you put a few more fish on the spawning grounds. In lower years, your escapement target is slightly lower, and it leads to fewer years with either low harvest or no harvest whatsoever. In practice, the way this is usually manifest within, escapement policy, at least in Bristol Bay, is to broaden the upper and lower bound of the escapement goal range. So there's a bit more flexibility by in-season managers to target the upper end of that escapement goal range or the lower end of that escapement goal range based on their perception of how many fish are coming back. But in general, contrary to what we might have expected a priori, targeting that theoretically optimum spawning abundance from a harvest perspective wasn't expected to result in increased harvest opportunity for the Bristol Bay fleet across all river systems.
Great. That's all the questions we have, and it looks like we're almost out of time. So I'd like to thank our speakers again. This was really fascinating. And I think this is not the last talk we're going to hear on MSE. I think we could probably do a whole workshop on how do you actually do it. But thank you both for really thought-provoking and extremely informative talks today. And with that, we will hopefully see you all on July 20th to hear about IYS, the International Year of the Salmon High Seas Salmon Survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much.